So we're going to talk today a little bit about research. Now, I know we actually covered a lot of this on the last day that we were actually in class, but that was forever ago at this point, and not everybody was there. So we are going to go through this a little bit again. Research is one of those things that is so incredibly important in all fields of study, whether it be the hard sciences, but also social sciences, because it's all about figuring out who your audience is, what your problem is, how do you actually properly solve it, because you don't want to just be spending time and money on something that isn't going to fix the actual problem. And research is going to help you determine that. So to start out with, there's two basic models of planning a strategy when you're working in the field like communication and specifically public relations. And that is the race model and the rope model. And basically they're essentially the same thing. They really is just kind of like substitute one for the other and it's fine. The race model basically says that the first thing you need to do is research. The second thing you need to do is take action, so figure out what it is you're doing. The third is to communicate that action, and then the last is to evaluate. As opposed to the rope, which is basically saying that the first thing you do is research. The second is objectives, which is planning for what you're going to do. The third is program, which is actually doing it. And the last is evaluation. Again, they're virtually indistinguishable from each other, but the important thing is they both start with research and they both end with evaluation. And evaluation is basically a fancy way of saying researching did what you do actually work. So when we research, there's a couple of different reasons why we do so. The first is you want to understand what is the actual issue, because again, you don't want to fix a problem that isn't a problem, or you don't want to fix the wrong problem. Another big thing is you want to figure out who your public is. Is it the public you think? Is it somebody that you should be tapping into some other public instead? Research is going to help you determine that. You're going to formulate your goals and objectives. Basically what this means is you figure out what you're supposed to do. What is our goal? For us, it might be to increase enrollment at ECC. That is a goal. An objective is a specific measurable one, where it's saying like, I want to increase, enrollment at ECC by 10% in the next year. So again, it's just being much more precise. Formulating your key messages is what's the message? How are we going to do that? And that is going to be based on your understanding of who your public is. Because remember, different publics have to have different messages, because one message is almost never going to work for everybody. And then lastly is our follow-up, so our evaluation. Did what we did actually work? Did we accomplish our goals? So the first is understanding the actual issue. What is the actual problem here? Because often what will happen is people look for simple solutions to their problems, especially in the field of business, especially in the field of, corporate work or nonprofits. And sometimes that simple solution isn't the actual problem. So in many cases, you have to go into the actual situation. You have to look at who you are. You have to look at what the problem really is. So is it that people don't know who you are, or is it that you don't know what you do? So for example, the example that I gave in class was when I was in undergrad, I did a campaign for the Chautauqua County adult daycare systems. And they believed that their problem was that nobody knew who they were. In our research, we discovered that the problem wasn't that people didn't know them. People knew who they were. Almost everybody had heard of them. But the problem was people didn't know what they actually did. People didn't understand, well, what is an adult daycare? Is the problem that you don't have customers, or is the problem that you don't have the right customers? Basically meaning, is it better to have people who buy things once, or is it better to have repeat customers? Obviously, it's better to have repeat customers, so maybe that's the problem. You need to figure out, how do we get a following? Because we're getting people to buy, but we're not getting enough people repeat buying. That is going to be something that would be told to you by research, by figuring out, okay, what is the actual problem? Who and what is causing the issue? Is it external forces? Is it society? Is it us? Is it that we aren't reading the public properly? Research is going to help you really narrow down what is the problem. And then, is it an obstacle or is it an opportunity? Basically, the difference here is that an obstacle is simply a roadblock. It's just something you have to deal with. But an opportunity has a potential for an advantage. Really, you have to think about this as optimistic versus pessimistic. Is the glass half empty or is it half full? Because anything can definitely look like an obstacle. But it's a matter of, okay, can we make this out for the better for us? Can we take this problem and turn it into a way that we can inform people of who we actually are? Yes, maybe something bad happened in our business, but maybe we're getting a lot of good exposure because of it, because we're showing how we took care of the problem, how we are taking our customers' safety first. Whatever it is, that would be an example of turning it into an opportunity, that there actually can be some good coming from this. So we also need to identify our public. That's a really big, important part of your research. Who is it you're actually trying to target? So we're first going to talk a little bit about the difference between a public and an audience. And then we're going to figure out, okay, what's going to work best for our public? What kind of messaging is going to work best for them? How do we specifically target them? And you're going to use things like demographics, psychographics, Geo Demographics, and age and life cycle. So let's start with going through a very simple definition of the difference between a public and an audience. And the easiest way to think about it is that a public tends to be your active followers. These are the people that you are actively trying to target, where an audience is your passive followers. So think for a second about on YouTube. Are you a public for a channel or are you an audience for a channel? For example, if you go to my YouTube subscriptions, I am subscribed to like 300 channels. I am not an active public for hardly any of them. I only actively watch maybe 4 to 10 of those channels in a given week or a given month. Most of the rest of them are ones that I've just subscribed to over the past 10 years and haven't bothered to unsubscribe to them. I'm not actually watching their content, so I am very much an audience member in this case. I am super passive. Occasionally I might watch one of their videos if it shows up on my home screen, but I'm not seeking it out. I don't have my notifications on for it. So the channels that I'm actively watching, I would be considered more of a public. Generally, you want to be able to distinguish between the two because you don't want to focus all of your time and your resources on your audience because they don't really care. Instead, you want to focus more on your public, unless what you're trying to do is convert your audience to your public. You want to make those people who are passive be more active. And then it's important to notice the difference between the two. Because why would you target people who are already following you if you're trying to get new people to follow you? So it's all about understanding who is actually paying attention, what level are they interested in you, and how should we target them. So some of the ways that we're going to break down who our audience or our public are and how we should properly target them is through the use of demographics, psychographics, geodemographics, and age and life cycle. So we're going to start with demographics, which is really the most basic model that we can use, which is the basic breakdown of who your audience, again, or your public is. And it's going to be broken down into things like gender, education level, race, age. So for me, I would fit into the category of I currently am 36, female, Caucasian, living in Western New York with an advanced master's degree. There we go. That is my demographics. But the problem with the demographics is that it's really, really overly simple. Because yes, all of those things about me, for example, are true, but that doesn't necessarily explain my purchasing habits. It doesn't really necessarily explain my viewing habits. It doesn't necessarily explain why I'm politically affiliated the way that I am. Because I might have more in common with somebody who is completely different in demographics than I am with a lot of people who are perfectly aligned with me. So this is a simple way of kind of identifying the basics, the fundamentals of people, but it's really only giving you a half story. Instead, you're better off taking a step deeper and looking at a person's or group's psychographics. This is looking more at the psychology of people. So it's what's happening inside their heads, not what's happening outside. So it's going to look at things like lifestyle choices, your political affiliations, your buying habits, your entertainment choices, all of those things, how you choose to live your life. Because, for example, for me, even though I might be, a 30-something, Caucasian female, I might have way more in common with a 60-year-old Hispanic male, just as an example, because it's not necessarily about who we are, it's about what we're interested in. And it's all about trying to figure out, okay, well, what is it? How do we target these people actually? One of the ways that people will do this, or companies will do this, is through something called data mining. Now, there is some legal questions around data mining. How much of it is, legal? How much of it is not? There's definitely ethical questions around it. You can definitely think about data mining as what's going on online, especially if we're talking about YouTube, Facebook, all of those sort of social media outlets, that if you search something once, you end up getting 1 million posts about it or ads about it. There actually is a feature that you can look at in your Facebook if you go through your account that'll tell you what does Facebook think about you, and it's part of its targeting marketing for you, where it'll tell you, based off of your location, based off of the things you comment on, the things that you share, the things that you read, it'll tell you all this information that it believes to be true about you, and that's the stuff that they're selling to marketing companies. So that's generally how people will find out these psychographics. Sometimes it is done through literally interviews, sometimes it is done through surveys, but a lot of times it's done through tracking somebody's online habits. Geodemographics, I think, is one of the most fascinating ways to look at people or groups of people and the problems that they face. Because geodemographics deals with specific geographic locations and the issues that face that. So things like voting limitations. This is obviously a big problem we're seeing with gerrymandering, where it's trying to figure out where district lines are drawn, in realizing that certain, demographics are more represented based off of where they live. So that links it over to the Geo Demographics, because they have access to the polls, where you make it easier for some people to vote and harder for other people to vote, because based off of where they live, they're likelier to vote for one political party than the other, or one politician than the other. That is a very straight up example of Geo Demographics. Or things like school access. One of the big problems that we saw a number of years ago when No Child Left Behind was passed is that the basic fundamental issue with that law is that based off of testing scores, schools can be closed, because the idea behind it was, if it's a poorly performing school, then we're not going to support it anymore and we're going to send those students to other places. But the problem is they weren't looking at, well, what are all of the other problems that are adding to this? That very rarely is a school poorly performing because of the students and the teachers alone. It's almost always because of this geodemographics, where when you look at the actual maps of the schools that were being closed, they were almost always in inner city poverty-stricken areas. And the reason they were performing so poorly is because most of those students in those schools had responsibilities that other students didn't have, where some of them were the breadwinner in their family. They had to work. Some of them were taking care of their younger siblings. There tended to be more problems with drugs and alcohol and family issues happening in those schools. So the problem is that they were closing these schools down and then sending these students somewhere else, which then made the dropout rate absolutely skyrocket. Or in a lot of times what they would start doing is they would take students from one, area, and they would send them to a school in a much higher income district, which then started causing all sorts of, like a caste system. And it ended up being absolutely disastrous. And it is still something we're suffering from today, is because people are not looking at these geodemographics. Or one of my favorite examples is when we look at something called a food desert. So a food desert is defined as an area where people do not have access to fresh fruits and vegetables and fresh produce because of where they physically live. So this is actually a map of the food deserts in Chicago. So if we look at it, you can see the worst food deserts are in the southern tip, and you can also compare it with the map on the right, where we're looking at the demographics of the regions. You'll see when these maps align that it's predominantly the African American districts that are having problems with the food deserts. If we were to take a map and overlap it with school access as well, you will pretty much see that there's going to be a perfect alignment there as well. That's why I personally, and I've said this in multiple classes, I have such a problem with the term lift yourself up by the bootstraps, because how do you do that if you don't have boots? And that's what things like systematic racism, systematic poverty is that you place people in a situation that, based off of their geodemographics, they literally cannot succeed, because it is impossible, because you have them no access to anything, and then you expect them to be able to fix their own problems when they have absolutely no solutions. That is a classic example of a geodemographic, and something that, if you want to solve a problem, you have to understand the full problem. And geodemographics, psychographics, demographics is going to help you do that. Age and life cycle. So an age cycle is very closely related to your demographics. It's how old a person is, but a life cycle is more based on your psychographics, which basically says, where are you in your life? Because where you are in your life is far more accurate and far more important than your actual age. For example, a 20-year-old with a newborn baby is going to have a lot more in common with a 45-year-old with a newborn baby than a 20-year-old without. So even though there might be a 20-year age gap there, and you'll even see this with personal relationships with friends, the older you get, the more ages will shift, because it's not the age that necessarily matters. It's where you are in life. And this is another thing that will help you in research really figure out who your audience is. Research is also going to help you formulate your goals and objectives. So again, it's going to help you figure out what is it we need to do. A goal is the general thing you are trying to do, and your objective is a specific and measurable outcome. So a goal would be something like, we want to increase awareness of our brand. Okay, that's great. But it doesn't really give you the full story, because your objective is then going to say, we want to increase visits to our website by 15% in the months of September and October. It's something much more tangible. And the reason why we try to distinguish between goals and objectives is because a goal helps you figure out what you want, but objectives help you specifically figure out how do you get there. They also help you determine if you were successful or not. Let's say it's even something like you have a New Year's resolution of you want to get healthier. Well, that's really vague. And one of the reasons so many people fail at that resolution is because they don't know exactly what that means. So an objective might be smarter in that case, where you say, I want to lose 15 pounds and I want to drink, 4 glasses of water every day, which you should be drinking 8, by the way. But we're going to say I want to drink 4 glasses of water every day. That would be something that makes more sense because you can very specifically say this is what it is. Your research is going to help you determine this because by talking to your demographic area, by talking to your audience, by talking to everybody, by researching, you're going to figure out what kind of goal do we actually have? What is the real problem and what is it we're trying to achieve? It's also going to help you formulate your key message, which is basically, well, what is it we want to say? Do we need to apologize for something that went wrong? Do we need to change over our platform? How are we reaching people? If you're a young, hip pizza place, where you've got wood fire, very artisanal pizzas, should you be advertising in the penny saver or should you be advertising through Instagram? Research is going to help you figure that out. Now, when I say research, and we'll get to this in a minute, it doesn't necessarily just have to be I'm doing surveys and I'm reading things. It could literally be based off of your experiences. You know that young people do not read the penny saver. You know that young people are on Instagram. So if you're trying to sell to young people, which if you're an artisanal pizza place, you probably are because you also know that older people are less likely to pay $30 for pizza. You know that just because of being alive. Because you understand your market, you understand the world that you live in. That's going to help you formulate your key message. Another example of this is sometimes we see this happen in politics. There have been a number of situations where a district was running red. They thought they were going to get Republican votes, and it turned out it went blue. So it ended up going Democrat instead. And now, of course, the reverse is true in other districts as well. But what was interesting about this particular case is when they researched why they, were so strongly projecting a Republican win and ended up with a Democratic win is because the surveys they were doing, the research they was doing was by calling people over the phone and asking them who were they more likely to vote for. Now, this makes sense, doesn't it? Because who is more likely to answer a phone to give an interview? Probably older people. And who's more likely to vote Republican? Usually older people. So not understanding properly how to research in this ended up completely messing up their demographics. It completely messed up their key messages, and it ended up giving false information. So research is going to help you understand who am I targeting, how am I targeting them, and what am I going to say. Your follow-up is basically trying to figure out, well, what happened. The campaign is over. We've launched, our new restaurant. Our social media blitz is done. Our fundraiser is over, whatever it is. Your follow-up is going to involve your evaluation. So did it work? Adjustment, which is, well, what changes should we make? So we held this event. We realized that it was successful in this regard, but not this regard. So our adjustment is going to be, okay, what can we do better next time? And then your next steps is, okay, now what do we do to maintain this? We became popular. We got people on our site. We got all these views. Again, maybe you're a YouTuber, maybe you're a podcaster and you had something go viral. So now you've got millions of eyes on you. Well, what do you do to actually maintain this? That is going to be part of your next step. But the main thing I want to talk about on this one is the idea of evaluation. Did it work? What you did, was it successful or not? Now, evaluation is not something you're going to do just once, your campaign is over. You're going to be working on this throughout the entire thing. Also, because when I'm saying campaign, often you're not doing like a single campaign. You come in once, we throw one fundraiser. It's usually something that's ongoing. You're working for this company and you're running their social media all day, every day. So at no point do you say like, oh, okay, this year is done. Let's look back at the past year. You're really probably doing it the whole time. So you're doing it pre-campaign, before we launch our social media, before we launch our special event, before we launch our fundraiser or our new website, whatever it is, or our video series. What's the issue? Again, what have we done in the past? Did it work? Really looking at all the pieces of who we are. Your campaign then is while it's actually happening because you want to adjust in real time. What's working? What's not working? As we're going, are we realizing people are not responding to our message? Okay, then how should we change that message? We don't need to commit to it. We can change midway through. And then post-campaign did it work? Did we get more people on our Facebook page? Did we get more, people booking for dinner this night? Did we sell more tickets? Did more people enroll in our program? All of those are going to be part of your evaluation and really help you figure out, okay, what's going on. So your next assignment is actually going to involve doing your own research. We'll talk about this at the end. There obviously will be an assignment sheet for it as well. But when you're doing your own research, I want you to think about this, that it doesn't have to, again, be something that is highly formal, because there's also a lot of informal research. There's a lot of different ways that we can conduct research that we're going to go through. So in conducting research, there's a difference between internal research and external research. formal research and informal research, quantitative versus qualitative research, which you probably remember that even from like a math class, and primary versus secondary research, which is probably something you know from like a history class, because there's a lot of primary versus secondary sourcing in history. So if we start by looking a little bit at the difference between internal versus external research. Internal research is when you examine who are we? Do we need to fix the problem? So let's say we look at the example of low enrollment at ECC. Internal research is going to say, okay, you know what? We are partially the problem because schedules aren't working the way that they should be, because budgets are being cut. So how do we fix the problem internally? Because we can launch a campaign to bring students in, but if we haven't fixed the internal problems first, it's not going to mean anything. Whereas in your external research is going to look at the actual environment. What are the problems outside of us? Maybe we are doing everything perfect, but we need to figure out what's going wrong in society. Why is nobody responding to us? Is it economics? What is actually happening? So this is kind of a silly example, but if anybody ever watched any of those, it's like Kitchen Nightmares was the main one with Gordon Ramsay, but there was like Bar Rescue was one, there's a hotel one, there's a whole bunch of different ones, where every time, this expert will come into this business to try to help them and fix it, and every single time the business owner will be like, well, it's the community's problem. That's why they're not shopping here. That's not why they're not coming here. Where the expert will then look in and be like, nope, you're the problem. It's because your food isn't good, you're overpriced, your service is terrible, your hours are terrible, whatever it is. That is an example of a company or a business not doing that internal research, not looking inward to see if we can fix the problems ourselves first. We also have informal versus formal research. Formal research is generally what we do in sciences, hard sciences. We definitely do this in history. Depending on what you're doing in a field like communication, you might do some formal research, but it's very systematic. It's very by the books. It's very detail-oriented. It has what we call a specific methodology, which basically means you have a very set plan for exactly how you're going to do everything, and you make sure that there's no flaws anywhere. Formal research can also be qualitative or quantitative, which we'll get to in a second. What I find tends to happen a lot in fields like social sciences, and this is going to be what your assignment is going to be based on, is informal research. Informal research isn't based off of things that are specifically measurable. We'll talk about some examples between these different types of research in a minute. But it's based more off of observations. It's based more off of conversations you have with people. It's based more off of just your general knowledge of the problem. This still technically is informal research. It's research, it's just based more on a person-to-person connection. As an example, when I was researching last year what the problems were within the communication department and how do we get more students interested in our program, we first of all found that the biggest problem wasn't actually the program itself, it was the school in its entirety, and it was just the lack of awareness outside of the school, that nobody even knew that our program actually existed. So that was the reflection of internal versus external problems. The other thing is that we were very informal with our research. At no point did I send out surveys, nothing like that. Instead, I just talked to people. I talked to freshman students coming in, I talked to high school students that I knew, I talked to returning adult students and said, like, what do you think? What do you think the problems are? What do you think we should do to try to reach people? Where do you think would be a good place to recruit from? That is very informal research. I think in some ways it can be incredibly helpful because it gives you a starting point to figure out what the actual problem is. And a lot of times it's then used to inspire formal research. So you have to get the idea first. You kind of talk it out. You kind of figure out, okay, what could the problem be? And then you can use that to launch into a formal study later on. This one tends to be very qualitatively based, where again, it's not usually numbers and statistics. It's more just, hey, how do you feel about this issue? For our assignment coming up for this unit, you will be doing informal research, just based more on just talking to people. We also have the difference between qualitative versus quantitative research. The easiest way to think about it is quantitative research is number-based, statistic-based. Qualitative research is person-based. It's more conversation-based. So quantitative research would be anything that deals with hard facts. But the problem with it is it's very often lacking context around those facts. So it could be something like, at the end of a lot of semesters, you will have to do like a class evaluation of your class, and you will have the section where you have to fill out, 1 to 5, how do you feel the professor did in these things? What do you think about the class in these things? And that is very much a quantitative research, because then the professor in the school will get back the numbers that say like, 4.7, you scored a 4.7 out of 5 in this, you scored a 2.6 out of 5 in this. But the problem with that is it doesn't give you any details. Like, okay, well, why did I score that? Is it because of this? Is it because of it? Doesn't really tell you any of that. But it is really good to give you just solid, hard, side-by-side numbers. Some examples of quantitative research would be things like surveys and things like content analysis. A survey is basically just asking people questions and they can just check off the boxes. We've all done surveys before. You know what these are. These are also the easiest way to collect information. You can do paper surveys. They'll often do surveys of people coming out of businesses. You've probably all seen people do surveys online before. You'll get an email saying, hey, I'm working for this marketing company. Can you take some time to fill out this survey? Really, really easy. The hard part about surveys is that it's really difficult to not be biased in it. Your opinions tend to seep their way into your survey just based off of the questions you ask, the samples you are providing. So for example, we have something called question bias, which is when you start a question by saying, don't you agree that? Or don't you agree with? Because you're already setting that person up to say yes. Because by saying no, you're already making them feel like they're wrong. So that very much is an example of a question bias. Also, asking too many questions at once is an example of a question bias. Something like, what's your name? Where are you from? What do you think of this? How do you feel about this? It just overwhelms people and it tends to make it difficult for them to actually answer. This is something I get a lot in politics. I get lots of flyers in the mail from different politicians, and they will always be started with, don't you agree that? And they'll word their questions in a way that are so leading and it's so obvious what they want you to answer. Research bias can literally exist in that you choose to research things in a way that already align with how you feel. You ignore information that doesn't align with what you believe. You tend to give more weight to information that you do. Again, you tend to question things in a way that make you feel like you are already correct because nobody wants to, or at least it's very difficult, to feel like what they believed is wrong. So research bias is an example, or what we call it, when the research that you conduct tends to already align with your ideals that you have, and that's a huge example of a bias. Sample bias is one we've already just talked about, where if you're asking people in a very specific area, you're going to get a very specific answer. If you're calling people on the phone, you have to consider, okay, well, people who are answering on the phone probably are making up a specific demographic of people that you're not going to get correct answers. If you're going to, ask questions about politics and you're asking at a Seth Rogen movie, or if you're asking at a Michael Moore documentary, you're probably going to get very different answers on these things. Another big issue with surveys is anonymity. If somebody is anonymous, they tend to be more honest with their answers, but it also leads to the problem of, okay, well, how do you make sure people are truly anonymous? And if they are anonymous, are they just giving you ridiculous answers? It can be problematic. One of the things that we've actually seen happen is this will occur with focus groups. This is something we definitely have seen happen with the Disney company specifically. There have been a number of different movies that have been released that ended up being bombs, even though early test screenings, focus groups all loved it. And then when people started looking into it, well, the reason these focus groups loved it is that Disney has a tendency of making focus groups out of the friends and family of the people who worked on the movie. So if you're invited to this, focus group for your cousin's movie, of course you're going to absolutely love it. So your answers are going to be completely biased. So that is absolutely an example of a sample bias. Content analysis is the idea that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes it's okay to just use information that's already there. So compile information that already exists. Use case studies. Look at what did other people do. That is something we did when we were launching our campaign for the communication department. I looked at every other communication program in the SUNY system. I looked at pretty much every program that existed in Western New York, and I specifically looked at the programs at all of the other community colleges. Monroe, Jamestown, Genesee, Niagara, a whole bunch of different ones. And we looked at, well, what are they doing? What worked for them? What didn't work for them? Because why reinvent the wheel? Might as well let what other people are doing affect what you're doing. You can just learn from their mistakes and you can benefit from their successes. So let's look at qualitative research now. So if quantitative is based more in the hard numbers, qualitative is based more in hard numbers, qualitative is based more on the quality of the questions and the answers. And it deals very heavily with context. So that would be something like, again, if you're analyzing or if you're evaluating a class afterwards, the how do you feel about this professor 1 through 5 is quantitative, but the section on the bottom where you say, what did you like about this class? What did you not like about this class? That is qualitative, because you're able to specifically say what worked, what didn't work. This tends to give you a much more broad view and a much more well-rounded view of what the problem is. What's difficult about it, though, is that it is incredibly time-consuming for somebody to compile, and it can be really, really hard to actually get like a solid, easy answer to present. Quantitative, it's easy to say, 87% of people believe this. Qualitative, it's really hard to do that because you really just kind of have to go point by point, person through person, and look at, okay, how did people actually feel? Some examples of some qualitative research, which is most likely some of the things you will be doing in your project yourself, would be an interview. You can do a focus group, which we already talked about a little bit, and you could do observation-based qualitative research. So an interview is when you sit down and you interview somebody. Pretty straightforward. These can be really difficult, though, because it can be hard to, again, quantify. It can be really hard to put into any sort of numbers. It can be hard to kind of boil down the basic ideas of it, but it does tend to give you a really, really solid full view of how do people feel about the issues. It'll give you a really solid view about the complexities of an issue, and it tends to make it better for you to understand what the problem really is. One thing to be aware of is, once again, you don't want to be biased. It's really easy to be biased, especially with qualitative information, because it's going to show up in the questions that you ask, how you ask those questions, what follow-up questions you ask, how you present yourself. All of those are going to be examples of bias that could happen. You also want to be very careful of close-ended questions. Asking people yes and no questions is not a qualitative interview. Instead, you want to open them up so that they can actually talk about themselves, so they can really talk about their thoughts and feelings without feeling like you're cutting them off. So again, we have a focus group. And a focus group is basically a group of people that you're interviewing all at once. These are most, again, ignore my kids yelling upstairs. These are most common in marketing and advertising. Again, we just referenced it with films where, you'll show a commercial, you'll show a toy, you'll show an idea. Sometimes they will do this in politics where, again, they'll bring in a politician and they'll speak to a small group of people where it's interview based, but it's instead of doing one-on-one, you're just doing it with small groups. That one's pretty straightforward. Observation is usually the first step of all research because you are observing a problem in your world. What's difficult about this is that you have to maintain objectivity, so you have to try to be objective through all of it, which can be extremely difficult. You also want to be unobtrusive. So basically what that means is that if people know they're being watched, they tend to behave differently. So instead, you need to try to just blend into the background. You have to gain the trust of the people you're talking to and your people you're working with. There's a really, really famous study from the 1970s that was published into a book called Jocks and Burnouts, and it basically was looking at how do high school students in Chicago, fit into different cliques, and how does that influence their personality? How does that influence their value system? How do they outwardly show what their value system is? And how the researcher was able to conduct this research and have so many people just so openly talk with her is that she worked in this school for like 2 years. She spent 2 years just sitting and just watching classes and watching people interact and slowly gaining the trust of the people she was watching. Where if you just go in on one day, people are going to behave differently because they know they're being watched. This goes back to when we were talking about social psychology. If people know they're being observed, they tend to really fall into line. They tend to behave in a way that they think they want or you want them to behave. So research through observation can be difficult, but it can be a really good starting point to try to figure out, okay, what is the actual problem here? Primary versus secondary research. This is something that you probably knew from a history class you've had to do. If you need primary sources versus secondary sources, this is the same thing. It's just a different way of phrasing it. Primary research is basically when you're researching the actual documentation. Secondary research is when you're researching and reporting on other reports of those actual documents. So, for example, this could be anything from, let's say you were researching the works of Shakespeare. Your primary research would be you're actually reading Shakespeare's plays. You're actually reading his letters. Now, to be clear, it does not mean you need to have the physical copies in your hands. It can be scans. It can be copies of these things. But it means that you're actually looking at the first-person documentations. Secondary research would be that you're reading a book written by a scholar in the 1950s talking about Shakespeare. So you're taking it through one degree of separation. So you're letting somebody else kind of influence how you feel about these things. There's definitely value in both of these, but it's just important to recognize that there is a difference between the two. I just want to throw out a couple of other terms just to kind of wrap this up. Triangulation is the term that we use to show that we're using multiple forms of research to get a more complete picture. So it means you might be doing content analysis, you're doing interviews, and you're doing observation. That's triangulation right there. It's when you're doing multiple types of research. So we also have the difference between theoretical research and applied research. And basically what the difference between these two is that theoretical research is not necessarily looking to solve the problem, it's simply looking to understand the problem. Applied research is looking to solve the problem. So some examples here would be, if anybody knows the difference between, say, an MFA and a PhD, I have an MFA. I am not a PhD. I am not a doctor. The difference between them is a PhD is the highest level you can get in the theory of something. So it's the theory of communication. It's the theory of film. It's the theory of dance. An MFA is the highest degree you can get in the actual doing of something. So that would be applied. So for me, I have an MFA in filmmaking, which meant I did study filmmaking to an extent, but I did not write a thesis. Instead, I made a film to graduate. I actually had to attend film school. That would be an example of applied research. Another example is even in the world of education. And again, this is another example of doctorate degrees, but it's a perfect description of the difference between theoretical and applied research, is that if you have a doctorate in education, you can have a PhD or an EDD. They are both doctors. The only difference between the two of them is that a PhD is a theoretical research. So you're looking to understand, okay, what is a problem, and then you generally write a book. An EDD is an applied research degree, which basically says that you are actually looking to solve this problem. So instead of, say, writing a book, you're actually implementing a program. You've created a new school. You've created a new educational program, something like that. Critical research is simply a catch-all term that we tend to give to research that is meant to do very important things. So there really isn't any one specific type of critical research. It's just a term that we tend to use when we're saying, oh, the research we're doing is critically important. It's actually going to do something for society. Generally, research we're doing in the fields of marketing and public relations is not considered critical research. Stuff that we're doing in the fields of maybe education, things that deal with things like, bigotry, that is critical research, because it really just kind of depends on how is it being applied. So for your assignment, which I will, of course, upload in the assignment folder, here on Blackboard, is all I want you to do is to research a problem that exists within your community. And you can define the term community however you like. It could be the gaming community. It can be your neighborhood. It can be, if it could literally be like a social group that you're a part of, or an ethnic group that you're a part of. Whatever you define as a community you feel that you're a part of, what do you think a problem is that exists within that community? And you're going to talk about, well, how do you know that? Talk to people. Observe people. Again, this is going to be extremely informal research, but it's just trying to figure out what do you think a problem is. Now, one thing to watch out for is the second step of this assignment is going to be to propose a fix for that problem. So don't make it something that's so big that it is impossible to fix or would be, extremely difficult to fix. Make it a problem that you believe could be fixed through communication somehow. So that is where we are going to leave this. And again, research is one of the more, I think, tedious parts of communication, but it's also fundamentally important.